Well, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie Braxick, and I'm a member of the Eradicate Hate Steering Committee. So first of all, thank you so much for coming to the session, and thank you so much for the time you put into preparing for such an important topic. One of the things, since we have a smaller group today, rather than use the QR codes to ask questions and have that go through, just raise your hand. And we'll just use a simpler old-fashioned format for Q&A and just take advantage of the more intimate group that's gathered here today. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Heidi Ellis. She is the director at Boston Children's Hospital Trauma and Community Resilience Center and associate professor of psychology at Harvard University. She will be moderating this session with two other participants. I'll let her introduce them and sort of lead the session, but this is such an important topic for us, and I'm so eager to hear what you have to say. So thank you for being with us here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Super delighted to be here today and to be thinking about professional standards, which are really going to be critical to moving this field forward. We have Heidi Hassan, who is joining us virtually, director of the Canadian Practitioner Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence. Hi, Heidi. And then Judy Korn, who's here from the Violence Prevention Network. So we are a small but mighty team here, and we hope all of you in the audience will be active participants, because I know lots of you have a tremendous amount of expertise in this area, so we're hoping to really make it a dialogue. Why don't we start, though, with Heidi, if you can kick it off for us.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for the flexibility of having me online join. So I will just be providing, let's say, a macro perspective on building professional standards, and then we can go back into details. If we can move slide, please, next slide. So what I wanted to say is really the field is, there's a consensus that the field is lacking clear guidelines on practice and standards for practice and robust guidelines, although there is a lot of on-ground experience and there are a lot of organizations that have developed guidelines, but what is lacking is actually what is most urgent for the field to produce is, of course, guidelines for practice, and we're talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention practice. We need guidelines on information sharing across across stakeholders, because, of course, every stakeholder has its own guidelines for information sharing, but we don't have a system in guidelines in terms of a system of information sharing. We need guidelines on risk assessment, and most importantly, guidelines on risk mitigation and guidelines on case management. So basically, everything in the field is still requiring robust guidelines. Next slide, please. I've put up the slide just because it kind of gives a visual idea. I think before developing guidelines, however, we have to understand that we need to develop methods for developing guidelines. There are specific ways to construct guidelines, and these ways need, in a way, to be followed in order for guidelines to be valid and to be reliable, and also to be testable, because we need to evaluate those guidelines against the reality of the practice. And so when we look at what happened in the field, or at least what currently is happening, the first PVE initiatives were funded, were kind of created out of a necessity, not necessarily out of a long history of evidence. And then program design was a bit, I can say, in many circumstances, mostly based on theory and expert opinion, which is valid. This is not to say that it's not valid. But that fortunately, we have now a wave of program implementation, delivery, evaluation of the programs that is coming along. Evaluation studies have really been produced in much more bigger numbers and more robust qualities across the 5 past year, I can say. And fortunately, these evaluation studies are providing us with effectiveness of programs. And where we need to know actually in terms of effectiveness of programs is not generally if they're effective or not. This is not a question we can answer, but rather what in a program is effective for what type of outcomes, right? And so these empirical studies are now, and this is the first step, in my view, in a robust method of producing guidelines, is the systematic review step. That is, this using a robust methodology to really synthesize, integrate the literature, synthesizes, rate its quality. In other terms, inform practitioners, policymakers, and stakeholders about results they can trust, results that are meaningful for the practice field. The next step in the methodology, once those systematic reviews have produced results, is really to produce what we call the Delphi Method. And the Delphi Method is really a method of consensus generation across expert communities. Why the Delphi Method is so essential in the field of CVE? Because the field of CVE lacks a history of evidence. So we're not talking about a question like vaccinating children from polio. You don't necessarily need extensive Delphi Method and expert consensus. But in the field of CVE, we need that Delphi Method because we don't have that evidence. So we need to succeed in making a happy marriage, in a way, between the empirical evidence and the clinical on-ground evidence and the expert opinion. And so the best way is really to produce what we call consensus-based standards or consensus evidence-based guidelines. And so fortunately, then, these guidelines will inform the implementation and the design of programs that need to evaluate those guidelines and then review the guidelines so that we can adapt them to the context, but also to an ever-evolving field. Next slide, please. And so really, this is to give a few examples or a few solutions. So at CPN Prev, what we're trying to do is really to create this kind of interactive method of developing and generating and testing guidelines, which is conducting systematic reviews and starting up Delphi processes, connecting those and the evidence and the guidelines and standards that come out of those Delphi processes and developing training and supervision. So training communities, creating communities of learners, because training is not a one thing, it's really a long-term learning process. So the creation of communities of learners and the training and the guidelines then connect to the work of communities of practice. And these can be, at CPN, we have a virtual community of practice because the country is wide. And so people use technology to improve practices, where we actually field test, if I can say, those guidelines in specific case examples that we have. And then again, connecting all that to the work of the network through multi-sectoral application and collaborations, if you want, in the implementation of those guidelines. And then we need a system that can help evaluate the way that those guidelines are being used and useful, both at the guideline generating step for communities of practice, that is in application in the field, for field development of excellence, which means through training and communities, and as well in terms of improving the collaboration between sectors. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that the guidelines that have been put out there in the past, it's good, it's great, but we need to develop a clear and robust method for guideline development, generating, testing, and like in a continuous development fashion, before we can really tell our practitioners working in the field that these are actually guidelines that they can trust. So that's it for me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heidi. That was so wonderful to hear your thinking. And as you were talking, these phrases were coming to mind, these terms. There's evidence-based practice, which is where we would love to get in our field. And in the meantime, there's practice-based evidence, which is we need to learn from people who are on the ground doing this. We're sort of in this bind because we're a really nascent field. We need to act now. There's an urgency to this. We need programs now. We need to take referrals now. We need to start doing something. And we don't want to go in the wrong direction. We can't afford to waste resources putting in place programs that are ineffective, and for sure we don't want iatrogenic effects where we're making things worse in the process of doing it. But we don't have the time to wait for the sort of long arc of science to take its course and give us that sort of empirical knowledge to really inform what we're doing. So how do we move forward? And I think what you've done is really sketch out this really rich approach to a both and. We need to be moving practice forward now with the best tools we have and integrating as much evidence as there is and keeping that integration going, iteratively improving what we're doing as we go. One of the things I was thinking about yesterday was in a panel with multidisciplinary teams were being talked about, and there were a number of fantastic practitioners up in these chairs, and I almost dropped dead because 3 of them said, when we talked about who would you like on your multidisciplinary team, said researchers. And as a researcher myself, I was floored. I'm like, really, you want me? Because there's such a really long history of tension between sometimes research and practitioners. And the idea that this field, instead of that, is coming at this with we need to hold hands as we go here so that we can learn from each other, gives me a lot of hope that we'll be able to move practice standards forward in a really meaningful way as we jump in and do this work. But Judy, those were some of my thoughts and
This
reactions.
is exactly what I thought when I listened to Heidi. I'm Judy Koren. I'm a practitioner, and I founded a practitioner organization 20 years ago in Germany. And we work with violent extremist offenders. And what we developed to be able to start working in the same time when we start developing standards or guidelines, what we did is we built teams with researchers and practitioners on one table. Because none of us, no profession, no organization, no individual is able to cope with this challenge on its own. We need this multidisciplinary teams, and we need the different expertise and viewpoints of the different professions. So my provocative question to you, Heidi, would be, what would you do during this process of developing these guidelines? Because we need to act now. But if we start acting in the same time when we start developing guidelines and we start developing evaluation standards and standards for conducting training programs, I think we are on a good way to react to what's happening now and to go a step forward. So,
any thoughts or reactions from the rest of the room? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, while hearing this, thinking about what are the risks with moving forward.
Yeah. I just thinking that. And it's a great question, so I will repeat it. What are the risks of moving forward with practice-based evidence, especially in this space of preventing violent extremism? I have some thoughts. I don't know if either of you want to.
you want to answer, Heidi, or should I share my thoughts? We can't hear you.
Please go ahead, Judy, and I'll follow.
Okay. Going back into the year when we started our initiative, there was no chance not to act. When you remember the time when in Germany we had lots of violent offenses against asylum seekers in the early 2000s, people killed other people. And I, as a practitioner coming from the field of violence prevention and working in the area of preventing violent extremism since I'm 16, so more than 30 years now, I felt there is a need for doing something. And what we did in the first years before I founded my organization is we developed an approach that I would describe as talking to extremists, not about them. And this is what we did. We went out to the groups that acted out violent against these groups of asylum seekers, and we asked them, why are you doing this? And we raised our hands and offered them dialogue and offered them talking to them. And I never ever thought about any risk. Having all my practitioner expertise in my backyard now, more than 30 years later, I wouldn't be as naive as I was in these times. But in the end, we succeeded. But I fully agree, you have to be aware of the risks. You have to be aware of what can happen to the practitioners themselves that try to work with this really dangerous target group. And you have to be aware of the risks for the community, for violent acts that can happen if you do the wrong things. I totally agree. And this is once again what I want to encourage, multidisciplinary work. So put onto the table people from the security authorities and start sharing your expertise and informations and make them part of the game and make them able to warn you if there's any sign of threat, may it be online or offline, to make the practitioners able to act, but being warned by those that monitor the field online and offline. This might be prevent risks, but if you work in this specific area of preventing and countering violent extremism, there will always be a risk that it fails or something happens that you can't foresee.
Yeah, so. And I would add, there's a risk to not doing anything.
Yeah.
So it's not that there's a good answer and then a question mark. It's like either way, there's a risk. And so how do you do it in a way that minimizes the chance that something will go wrong? And multidisciplinary teams, I think, that different perspectives on a case is critical. And it doesn't mean you have to take something else out of your toolkit. Here's the array that we have right now. A lot of it is law enforcement based. You can add to that some alternative paths and approaches and strategies, and still have the robust history of law enforcement efforts. Heidi, you were going to add something, I think. Were you? If you are, you're on mute.
I am on mute.
Yeah,
now you're off.
We can
now
hear
you're
you.
good.
I think a lot has been said. So I really was hoping the people in the room have more questions, and I would leave room for that. I think you have said that this risk zero does not exist.
Yeah.
And should not be expected from practitioners in this field. This is not possible. I think the fact of what Judy said about integrating researchers from the onset is really crucial, because this is when, with the help of researchers, the work as we go that we have as practitioners can actually become in and by itself a data that we learn from, that is integrated into the larger empirical data that helps produce guidelines. So we really think about it as a constant work in progress. So as Heidi said, the risk would be bigger in a situation where people need help, to refrain from providing that help for the purpose for really some quote unquote scientific standards that are completely irrelevant to be applied as is in a rigid way in the field where we work, because the field is constantly evolving. The extremism landscape is constantly evolving. The risk, the way that groups and youth and older people can violently act out is also evolving. So it really speaks to the fact that teams have to integrate researchers and practitioners from different fields. And this means also that the funding of programs, the way we fund programs, the criteria we establish to fund programs must be reconsidered in that perspective as well.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Judy in a minute. I just want to, you made me think of one other element here that I want to talk about, which is we talk about the importance of evaluation. The quote unquote gold standard of to evaluate a program is the randomized controlled trial. It suggests you should know exactly what you're doing and do it with one group and not with another. And it's just simply not appropriate to the questions we're asking and the place we are in the field. But there are other models of evaluation that can do exactly what you're talking about, the sort of rapid feedback that actually is informing and shaping and developing. So formative evaluation or developmental evaluation, those models are actually research models of evaluation that are constantly feeding back and improving as you go. I think the difference between being in the kitchen making the soup and sort of tasting it and changing the ingredients as you go versus taking the soup out to the table and saying, is it good? Do you like it, Brett? And we're not at that stage. We may not be there for a long time, but it doesn't mean we can't do a whole lot in the meanwhile to improve what we're doing and make sure we are addressing risk to the best of our abilities.
And if I may add something to your picture, I think the best thing would be if you have someone beside you in the kitchen knocking on your shoulder saying, not too much salt, please.
Yes.
So this is what we did in the beginning. We had a team of researchers when we started our first training program, and they attended the meetings. They interviewed every participant. They interviewed every practitioner. They interviewed every prison staff or security staff that we worked with, and they feedback to us, it looks like you better should change this and you should modify that. Your participants told us that this is not as effective as you might think it would be, so you must be open-minded to have someone beside you who's not a practitioner, who's not an expert in delivering this specific type of training to violent extremists, but who is an expert in evaluating you and monitoring you and coaching you in providing this kind of specific work. So it's a matter of trust. Yeah, if you integrate a researcher in your team from the very early stage, it's a matter of trust, and you have to be really open-minded to be criticized and to be feedbacked about what you try to do in your everyday life.
So can we hear more about some of the models you have coming out of Germany? Let's hear it.
Yeah. As I told you, I started 20 years ago when I founded my organization. And at that early stage in Germany, there was no other organization working with this specific target group of violent extremist offenders that are not yet willing to leave their extremist environment, not willing to change their violent behavior. Violence Prevention Network is not an exit provider. We are working with people that still are convinced to stay in their extremist environment. And we do this in the prisons in Germany, and we do this in cooperation with the security authorities. But at that early stage, there was no methodology, no approach, nothing. And this is why we not only had to develop an approach to reach out to this specific kind of target group, we also had to develop a train-the-trainer curriculum. And this is what I heard yesterday and today a lot, that there's a need for practitioners in the US to be trained to deliver this specific type of service to the target group of violent extremist offenders. And we did this. We developed a train-the-trainer program, and we after some years of offering these type of training to other practitioners in Germany and to other CSOs to make them able to also work in this specific area, because we weren't able to deliver it to all over Germany. So we asked others to come on board, and we trained them. And we developed some criteria, some general criteria, what we think is is necessary if we talk about training practitioners to work with violent extremists. And the first thing is what we discussed, the curricula have to be developed by researchers and experienced practitioners. There's a need that we have people from different professions on board if we develop such a training program. And we need to pay attention to what's needed from the viewpoint of, for example, social workers or people that work in adjacent fields like gang violence or something like that. And we also need to integrate the newest findings from the researchers, for example, about the development of the extremist movements. Yeah, and what is also a really basic assumption of our training program: only teach what you have implemented yourself. Yeah, try what you teach, and don't try to teach something that you are not an expert in. And when it comes to working with violent extremist offenders, ask an experienced practitioner to come on board if you want to train others to do this job. But it's not enough to teach them about the newest developments. It's necessary to teach them, how can I talk to these specific type of people? How can I convince a person who's part of a violent extremist group to think about, to question himself, and to think about the possibility of leaving this group? What type of techniques can I use to sort doubts in the mind of these people? So you need someone who is experienced in this specific kind of work. And what's another general remark is the training program itself need to have two different pillars. The first is an intense kind of theoretical training about these techniques and about the different topics I need to address and I need to be aware of. And it needs a long-term coaching. When you train a practitioner, assure that you are able to coach this person minimum 12 months when he or she is trying to establish these training programs with the violent extremists themselves. They need coaching. They need supervision from the people that trained them. So it's not a short-term approach. It's a long-term initiative if you want to make sure that there are experienced practitioners out in the field. And this is, Heidi, when it comes to the funding issue, we need long-term funding, not only in the US, but also in all the other countries that want to address this issue. Yeah? It's not done in 3 months. You can't de-radicalize an extremist in 3 months. This is a long-term relationship that you need to establish with this person. And the last thing is, when we are talking about who may be those people that can be trained, who are the practitioners we are talking about? And what we experience is that it's not possible to teach this specific type of work in universities. They need to have experience in somewhat adjacent fields like social work or psychology, counseling other people. So it's training practitioners to, it's making them able to deliver and add on to what they already can deliver. Yeah, and I think there are different types of content that need to be part of this specific type of train-the-trainer programs. And one of the most important things, what you need to train these people in, is self-reflection. They need to be aware of why they want to do this specific type of job. And they need to develop a counseling attitude. De-radicalizing extremist offenders is not to lecture them. It's more assisting them in a process of change, and a long time-taking process of change. I'm only the assistant. I can question you. I can sort doubts in your minds. I can perhaps help you to find answers to the questions that you ask yourself, but I can't lecture someone to change his behavior and mindset. This is not possible. And you have to develop this type of counseling attitude before you start working. And the other important thing is it's not only about changing violent behavior, it's also about questioning the ideology of someone. And I know if someone here is in the room who did this work and who talked to a violent extremist, what they are really experts in is arguing against. And if they feel that you attack their ideology, they will argue against. So you have to do it the other way around. You have to offer dialogue, and you offer a relationship, and you have to show interest in the person itself, not only in the offense, in the person itself. And if you are able to build trust to this person, then you can sow doubts in the minds of these people. But if you argue against, they won't work with you. It won't be possible to get access to their biography, to their history, and it won't be possible for us to deal with all the issues we have to talk about. These are only some ideas I can offer you when we talk about standardizing training programs or training curricula. And I think I will stop here.
Great, thank you so much. I see there's already questions and comments from the audience. So, Brett.
I want to circle back to Heidi for a moment. Because a key part of the Canadian Practitioners Network approach of identifying the standards was the systematic review. I fully support systematic reviews. I have two members of my team who want reading non-systematic reviews that's being conducted. And part of what that exercise taught us is that no practitioner has the time to spend the 2 months. Those non-systematic reviews, pages. So how do we synthesize those reviews and get the results of those reviews in a format that is practitioner friendly and that can ultimately inform that Delphi process? Because if no one is taking the time to read through them, are we getting the maximum value out of them, or is there a way we can translate that better into our practice? We may need to
Heidi, can you hear?
I was just saying I can't hear.
I think we have to translate.
Okay, I'll give the short version, and Brett, wave me off if I've got
Yeah,
if I'm
sorry.
missing a nuance. But wonderful systematic reviews, but boy, it takes a long time to read them, and practitioners generally don't have the time and don't do it. So how do we actually get that information into a form that can be digested, absorbed, and used by practitioners? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, now you're mute again.
Oh,
You're good.
yeah. So actually that's as a practitioner myself and a researcher, when I conduct the systematic reviews, I always say, who has time, right? This is where the entire knowledge mobilization process comes into play. And so we don't, conducting systematic reviews is very important, and maybe researchers have time and yet to look at a 40, 50, 60-page report. But then there's the entire process of making the results from the systematic reviews meaningful and translatable to practitioners on ground. And for that, a lot of tools exist. There are knowledge mobilization tools. It could be things as simple as, just the infographic with the basic results. It could be videos. So there are a lot of, and at CPN, we produce those tools for practitioners. We produce those tools for policymakers in terms of the recommendations as well. So the idea really is not to overburden the practitioners at all. But the idea is really to be able to advise the practitioners on the level, on the type of evidence they can trust, and transform that evidence in practices, in standards, in guidelines that are practical, useful, meaningful to their practice. And so if I may say, just as in agreement with Judy, I do not think that systematic reviews can be conducted only by research teams. They have to be conducted by teams that have researchers and practitioners for the reason that practitioners have the deep-rooted understanding of the nuances that are not captured by many empirical studies or even by the systematic review itself. And so this is why it is a constant combination of empirical clinical intervention knowledge and empirical research-based generated knowledge. And why I want to highlight this idea of, connecting very closely to the practitioner, it is because by definition, guidelines and standards that are based on consensus erase the subtleties. Consensus means blurring the details. And so this is why when we're ending the Delphi process and I look at the recommendations that are generated, and part of me says, oh my God, all this work for that, for the obvious, right? And I think, Adam Williams said in his book that research is the process of expensively, painfully, and slowly finding the surprisingly obvious. So you do experiment that. But what I'm trying to say here is that guidelines that are generated by those Delphi processes and consensus always kind of brings to the center and removes those very, unique and specific details that Judy is referring to when she's saying experienced practitioners have to be on board, and you also have to sustain and support the capacity of practitioners to develop senior expertise in the field. This is essential because these then will become the practitioners who will be able to supervise and to support the generations of other practitioners that will be coming. So the issue of sustainability is really a central question. And unfortunately, a lot of the promising interventions die because of lack of funding and sustainability, not because of lack of good results with the clients, with the client population.
Thank you, Heidi. If I can maybe be aspirational for a moment, I think we need to move from expecting practitioners to kind of on their own absorb information and implement it to a place where we have systems of training so that people can move into this field. And I'm a trauma psychologist, and I didn't get there by picking up 9 systematic reviews and trying to figure it out. I got there by after my training as a psychologist, building on that by having an internship focused on trauma, having a fellowship focused on trauma. So where is that? In our country, we don't have that yet. I get people all the time calling me up and saying, hi, I'd love to train in this. I'm like, I'd love you to train in it. And we don't have a training mechanism for you. So we kind of cobble things together and make a postdoc out of dust. But we need to get to a place where we actually have, we're a field, and we have a training program and we're a specialty, and we can integrate some of that nuance, Heidi, that otherwise gets lost because those senior clinicians that you're talking about or senior preventionists can then be the trainers in programs. But I don't know, have you
I just
gotten
wanted
there?
to add one remark. It's not a one-way. It's not only researchers giving information to practitioners. It's although the other way around.
For sure.
Yeah, and this is what makes it fruitful to have this multidisciplinary teams. Yeah, if we all can influence each other, and Violence Prevention Network was appointed in 2017 from the German government to develop the standards of how to conduct a de-radicalization program in prison. And we had a lot of talks with the German government, and then we agreed with them, okay, it's a funny exercise, we can do this, but it will be more sustainable if we put on the table every CSO that is operating in the prison system in Germany in this specific area and a team of researchers. Give us 2 years, and then we can give you the standards in Germany for delivering de-radicalization programs in the prison system. It was really expensive to do this, but in the end, we have this now, and you can be sure if you are imprisoned in Germany and you are offered a de-radicalization program, it will be the same standards in every prison in all over Germany. And every CSO, it's done mostly by CSOs in Germany, every CSO is operating under the standards that they altogether developed. This is sustainability, yeah, and this is we implemented all the expertise of everyone who has experience in this area, and it would have been an easy job for our organization to write this down in 15 pages and send it out to the government, but it would have had no impact.
Yeah.
So,
Is that a hand coming up? Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Heidi, the other Brett, the north of the border one. So I was going back to your point about the early program design being based on theory and expertise, when arguably we didn't have a whole lot of theory back then either. And one of the ways that that's been a bit of a challenge is program design through analogy. Like we've had these waves of let's learn from gang interventions, let's learn from wraparounds, let's learn from suicide prevention, let's learn from cult interventions or new religious movements. I feel like the field's been getting better, so we're getting better at drawing those connections, but I was wondering if you can reflect on your own sort of experiences of what lessons to draw from other fields in the course of trying to be more professional in this field.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to jump in with my plug that I've been making everywhere in the hopes that it will move systems. I'm going to draw from the trauma field. In the US, 20-some years ago, 9/11 happened, and trauma at that point was really a kind of nascent field. It wasn't well developed. There weren't well-defined interventions. There was maybe one, not so many more, and it was not a household word. Our Congress put in place what's now called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and funded SAMHSA, our Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to have a network of grantees. And I emphasize the word network because what they wanted to do was solve this problem of how do you move science and practice forward holding hands so that both are at the table. And the way they did it was they had a handful of more academic center type, researcher type grantees who were experts in the knowledge base, the research base around particular types of trauma or populations. And then they had a bunch of grantees who were community practice sites. They were on the ground, in the field, in the service systems, doing the work. And they said, we're going to fund you, and you're going to specifically build into your program ways to work with each other so that this whole field can move forward together, and it's not a one-way street. It's not the academic centers should teach the community practice sites. It's that you need to learn from each other. And that was 20-some years ago, and if you look at where trauma is as a field now, it's a completely different place. And I think in large part, I credit SAMHSA with their model of moving it at lightning speed forward because they married practitioners and researchers in a very intentional way. And I think we're at the same point in this field. And if we could do that, if we could say there are people on the ground and there are researchers and we're going to fund them to be together moving the space forward, that we could really advance practice standards quickly. Yes.
I think one of the points Judy made is something, it seems very subtle, but I think it's important. I don't think we do it as well in the United States. That's the incorporation of feedback to practitioners from those with whom they are working. You know, we still maintain a very hierarchical nature and how in our state, physicians and nurses or physicians and patients, and I think what is the breakthrough, in my opinion, of what you've done there is that open feedback system, because intention doesn't match effect. So we are all well intended in what we say and in what we do, but when we get the feedback that the effect was not that, in fact, it came across differently or some other way, that's how we get better. But that requires a degree of humility and to your point, a level of seniority and being able to receive feedback and not take it personally, but say, it's in how I felt about what you said, it's not about you. That is a very sophisticated skill set that I don't think we screen enough. So A, I want to applaud the use of the feedback. B, the criteria for who's going to be allowed to be in this complex advising, coaching, developmental training system is a key part of that, because you have to be in a position where you have the strength to receive honest feedback to get better, that self-awareness and the healthiness of the whole construct. And I just don't think we do that well enough.
It's a great point. And I love, the thinking that it's not just academics and practitioners that need to be listening to each other. It's also the clients themselves, the consumers, the people we're trying to serve. How do we build more participatory models of research and practice?
Because in the end, this whole work is about how can I make them get rid of me. It's about self-responsibility that we want to encourage them to develop. So, if we offer them an atmosphere where they can feedback us, okay, this was the impact of what you questioned me, and this happened. This is a process of change that can start then. Yeah.
Other questions or thoughts from the audience? Or from Heidi and Judy. We can just open it up. Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you.
But I'm going to ask it of you. Drawing from Judy's experience of building that training in Germany, how would you, and I welcome everyone's input on this, but Heidi, how would you build that training in the United States? Recognizing, as you said, it doesn't exist now besides postdocs created out of dust.
Yeah. And this probably moves us towards our deliverable conversation we're supposed to have. There's the what could we do now, in the next year, and there's what could we do in the next 10 years. And I think we need to be asking both of those questions at the same time. I do think, so Brett, turning it back to you, you have started a Prevention Practitioners Network that is, in fact, becoming a platform for centralization of training and ideas, the best information that's out there. And as you know, I've been closely involved and a big fan of it from the start. And it's actually, I think, really moving from who knows a piece of knowledge here who can come and speak on a panel to a much more integrated sense of, okay, how do we collectively learn the tools that are out there and collectively come together around cases and sharing some of those ideas. So I think that's what can happen in the short term. And I think what can happen in the 10-year term is that some of those ideas are going to become tools that have training curriculum that go with them. They're going to become models that have a training program that goes with it. There's going to become, someone in a school of social work is going to raise their hand and say, hey, I can run a practicum here. And we're going to start seeing the seeds of graduate level programs and specialty programs emerge. But it starts with that sort of networking of who is on the ground doing it and how do we bring them together as a community to say, yeah, there's a there. And we can begin to elevate it. Do either of you want to? And that's from my little corner here in the United States. So I don't know if either of you want to speak from where you're sitting.
Regarding what doing
regarding
next, or?
Regarding like how you sort of move from where we are to a field that someone can become trained in. What are the next steps?
Yeah, what we did is we funded Violence Prevention Network in the USA and start our training program in January. And start practitioners here in the Pittsburgh area to bring our expertise across the ocean.
Yeah.
Together with US practitioners to make sure that this is adaptable to the US and not only working in Germany, but this is what we found is practical. So
Yeah.
we start training.
Yeah.
Is this a place to talk about that sort of third board that you chatted about?
Just, I can't hear you, but louder.
Is this a place in the discussion to talk about that third board or council that you talked about for the United States?
Yeah, good idea. We are looking for people from the Pittsburgh area. I don't know where you are based, sitting here. We are looking for people here in the community who want to engage in Pittsburgh and starting a program on making people able to work with violent extremists. So if you have any interest in engaging in this, I'm here today and tomorrow, so talk to me and then perhaps we can arrange a meeting. We would be happy if people engage and want to be part of this, because everyone can make a difference.
Wonderful. And I love that doubly, because that moves us into our deliverables conversation. So we have one already. So a
next
meeting.
year I have to tell you if it worked.
And maybe I would just toss out to the group, is there anything else we should think of as, very concrete next step in this area, so we don't return a year from now and say, oh, if only science researchers and clinicians talk to each other? What is our concrete next step to make sure that that actually puts us on a path? Brett.
I will not commit to the Delphi process instead. We are happy to take our review of the 9 systematic reviews, bring that back to the Prevention Practitioners Network, and get their input on top-line findings across those 9 systematic reviews, so that we can produce some of those translation-type tools that Heidi was created.
Fantastic. I love it. And I will agree to join you in that. We are down to our final 10 seconds. So let me just take those moments to thank Heidi and Judy so much for
Thank you.
sharing today, as well as
Thank
the
you so
amazing
much.
work that you both do. So thank you, and thanks to all of you.